how much of what we learn today about meditation is original, goes back to the earliest teachings, and how much of it is more recent, involves teachings and practices that have come up in the centuries and millennia after the earliest teachings. This is a big question that we're going to try to begin to answer on today's video, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos, click the bell down below. I have a new course just out at the Online Dharma Institute called Work, Money, and Pleasure, the Buddha's Teaching to Lay People. And I think it will be of interest to a lot of you. Basically, when we learn about early Buddhism, most of what we're learning about is material that the Buddha taught to everybody, to lay people and to monastics. It's deep teachings about meditation and so on. But the Buddha also had a number of very interesting teachings he gave just to lay people about living lay lives, about work, about money, finances, and about how lay people should pursue pleasure. And these are things that I think we can take into our lives and into our everyday lives. And so they're not the kinds of the Buddhist teachings that you only can use during meditation, but they're teachings that you can use all the time. So I hope that'll be interesting to you. I've got a link to it down below, and so check it out and see what you think. And while you're over there, I hope you will also check out the other courses that I have at the Online Dharma Institute, because some of them may also be of interest to you. So today's video comes about because of a question by Photistix, who asked a while ago about where our practices of modern meditation come from. Are they practices that go back to the original teachings, perhaps of the Buddha, or are they modern refinements of some kind, either refinements that came up during the centuries and millennia after the Buddha, that there seems to have been some changes in the way meditation was perhaps practiced. And this is, to begin with, a very controversial and ongoing topic of scholarship. So nothing that I'm going to say in today's video, I think, is set in stone. It's all the material I'm going to be talking about today is fluid. It involves interpretations based on the evidence that we have so far. I think a lot more is going to have to be done. And there's going to, as I say, it's going to be controversial. There are different ways of approaching the same material, and I'll get into some of that in this video. Now, what it seems is that perhaps, arguably, the biggest refinement or change in mindfulness meditation in particular, and I'm going to be spending most of today's video talking about mindfulness meditation in particular, because it's probably the most famous kind of early Buddhist meditation that we know of, and of course very popular nowadays. Probably the biggest refinement in mindfulness meditation involves the relative de-emphasis of jhana, which are jhana are particular states of absorptive meditation. They're concentration meditation, so we can think of them as sort of a companion to mindfulness. If we think of the Eightfold Path, right mindfulness is the 7th step in the Eightfold Path, and right concentration is the 8th step in the Eightfold Path. And so what has happened over the years, and we'll get to this, is a relative de-emphasis of jhana, of concentration, as opposed to mindfulness itself. And so what we see with the sutta on mindfulness, the mindfulness meditation began basically with a sutta called the Foundations of Mindfulness, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta, otherwise known as. And in that sutta, or I should say, originally that sutta seems to have been much smaller than the version that we have nowadays. And so as a result, it must have expanded somehow. Things must have been added to it. And I think it's, in general, a syndrome in conservative kinds of cultures that early texts tend to expand in size. Now, why is that? Because in conservative cultures, of which early Buddhism, certainly Theravada would be an example as well, where in Theravada Buddhism there is a wish to preserve the early teachings. In early Buddhism, there was this, as I say, this wish to preserve these teachings to be passed down the centuries. And as a result, nothing was thrown out, as it were. Things were not, in general, would not have been eliminated from a text unless simply by oversight, in other words, a mistake, which does happen, of course. It's more likely, however, that things would be added. That is, that people would err on the side of expansion of texts rather than of contraction of texts. If anybody in a group thought, oh, wait a sec, this should be put there, they'd put it there. Whereas if maybe one person in a group thought something didn't really belong, the rest of the group would say, well, let's just leave it in there and let future people decide about what they want to use and what they don't. Now, the contemporary monastic and scholar Bhante Sujato, Bhikkhu Sujato, has argued that originally, Satipatthana, originally mindfulness, was intended as a basis to achieve jhana. So, for example, we find in an early sutta, the nun Dhammadina is asked by a laywoman about the role of mindfulness. And the nun says, in an early sutta, she says, the four foundations of mindfulness are the basis of concentration. And here, once again, we think of the difference between the seventh and the eighth part of the Eightfold Path. Nowadays, when we look at the Eightfold Path, we may be a little confused. We may think mindfulness is kind of the flourishing of the path. Mindfulness is where the path really comes to an end, as it were. That's the thing that leads us to awakening. And so we wonder why it is that mindfulness comes before concentration on the Eightfold Path. It looks as though, from the Eightfold Path, as though mindfulness is a preparation for concentration, rather than the reverse, which is really what we're generally taught nowadays, that we learn concentration in order to be better at mindfulness. It seems that in the early texts, it was the reverse. It was rather that mindfulness was a preparation for concentration, and that's what, or at least an argument can be made in that along those lines, and that's exactly what Bhante Sujato argues. So in particular, what he argues is that, well, we have four foundations of mindfulness in this text. So if we look at this earliest text of mindfulness, probably the earliest complete description of meditation in the world, we have four different general practices of mindfulness. We have mindfulness of the body, we have mindfulness of feelings, that is positive and negative feelings, mindfulness of mental states, that is the character of your mind, and then finally mindfulness of dharmas, or of, it's difficult to describe the last one, but we'll get to that in a minute. The point is that in the text as it exists now, we have a lot of what are called insight refrains. That is to say, a lot of different refrains in the various sections about being aware of the arising and falling of all of these states, the arising and passing of them. And these are supposed to be our way to gain insight into the character of reality, the character of existence, that it is fleeting, that it's inconstant, and that alone is supposed to be productive of liberation. In other words, it's supposed to get us directly to awakening, without necessarily any concentration, deep concentration like jhana. Now, what Bhante Sujato argues is that originally we didn't find these insight passages in the first three of the four foundations of mindfulness. These seem to have been later additions. So, in his way of thinking of it, mindfulness really wasn't involved so directly in insight into the nature of reality. Rather, it was sort of a method of, again, calming the mind so that we could achieve jhana, and then from jhana, insight, and then awakening. Now, it's also, however, the case that within these first three foundations of mindfulness, we do see a refrain talking about how each of these is supposed to be for the sake of knowledge and vision. Knowledge and vision is what it says. Now, this is a complex argument, and I'm just going to sort of go over it quickly here, but Bhante Sujato's general feeling is that use of knowledge and vision in the first three of these four foundations is supposed to be indicative of a kind of extrasensory perception of other people's bodies and minds. And he looks to a discourse in a different collection of suttas, the Digha Nikaya, to emphasize that point. That is to say, when the mindfulness sutta recommends that we pursue mindfulness of the body, let's say, in order to achieve knowledge and vision, what it's saying, according to him, is that we're supposed to be using this mindfulness to have awaken our extrasensory perception, to see the bodies of others, to feel, to understand the minds of others, sort of at a distance. And that is certainly one possible interpretation of this phrase, knowledge and vision. However, it's also important to say that knowledge and vision, this phrase knowledge and vision, is a typical phrase used in insight as well. So typically when in early Buddhism you're talking about insight into the nature of reality in a way that is productive of awakening, insight into the inconstant nature of reality, into its unsatisfactory nature, into its selfless nature, non-self. This is described as knowledge and vision as well. So the fact that that phrase is repeated in these first three, even in Bhante Sujato's reconstruction of these first three foundations of mindfulness, because what Bhante Sujato tries to do is to reconstruct what he thinks the earliest version of this sutta might have been like. And it's an interesting thing to do, based on the suttas we have available to us nowadays in Chinese and in Pali and other languages. Try to come to an idea of what the original sutta might have been like. We find this knowledge and vision phrase even in that reconstruction. Knowledge and vision might indeed have been intended originally to mean insight. So, and even if it wasn't intended originally to mean that we were supposed to gain insight, it certainly is possible that the early monastic redactors of these texts, or oral speakers of these texts to each other, might have easily taken it that way, and so have considered that mindfulness itself was productive of liberation because there were these passages of insight within the first three foundations. This is somewhat technical and a little bit going off the deep end here because we're really into the technical details of the texts. But what I'm trying to argue in a nutshell here is that while Bhante Sujato says that originally mindfulness was simply a way for us to attain concentration and jhana, it's not entirely clear, even from his reconstruction of the text, that that's the case. That is certainly one possible reconstruction, but there are other ways we could come at this text that might say that, well, mindfulness may have actually had a liberative function even back in the very earliest examples of mindfulness. So we've discussed now the first three foundations of the four. Now the fourth foundation is mindfulness of dharmas, or of phenomena, or there are different translations we can use of the word dharmas here. It doesn't really matter for us. The great scholar Bhante Anālayo just leaves it as dharmas. But basically what we're doing is having mindfulness of characteristics of the mind and body that arise for us within Buddhist thinking, Buddhist theories. So in the text that comes down to us today, we have such things as mindfulness of the aggregates, the five aggregates. That is to say, the body and the four parts of the mind. We're supposed to have mindfulness of the different sense bases. That is, mindfulness of each of the senses, mindfulness of the things that those senses are sensitive to, the external forms or sounds or touches or smells or tastes and so on. And we're supposed to have mindfulness of the Four Noble Truths. And that is in the text that comes down to us today. However, in the original text, all of that doesn't seem to have been there. And this is something that is really not so controversial. I think pretty much everyone agrees on that originally the fourth foundation of mindfulness was much, much smaller. It only included two things. That is, mindfulness of the hindrances and mindfulness of the 7 factors of awakening, which also we have down today. But the hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening are should be seen as opposites to each other. That is, there are certain states of the mind that are hindrances, that hinder our ability to achieve jhana, to achieve mindfulness, to achieve awakening. Those are such, I've done a video on them, I'll put a link to it up here, but very quickly, there are things such as sense desire or ill will, anger. There's such things as being too tired or being too wound up, and your mind, monkey mind, sort of going on without being able to stop and concentrate, and doubt. These are the 5 hindrances. And so being aware of the arising of the hindrance, it says, even in the original text, according to Bhante Sujato, the arising and the falling of the hindrance. And this is where we see the potential of insight in the original text, according to Bhante Sujato, is in the hindrances, because we're to see their arising and their falling away. And when it comes to the 7 factors of awakening, then we're supposed to be aware of when they're active, in other words, when they're there, and when they're not there. And the 7 factors of awakening are, as well as the hindrances, both of these concepts are also intimately bound up in jhana, in concentration, which is another way that mindfulness and concentration seem to be joined at the hip. In particular, of the 7 factors of awakening, 4 of them are really directly related to jhana, or these concentration states. One of them is, the Pali word is piti. It's sometimes translated as rapture or joy. That is what comes to us from the first jhana. When we're in the first jhana, is this sort of surging kind of feeling of joy or happiness. Some people call it rapture, which may be a little bit over the top, but nevertheless, you get the point. That is one of these 7 factors of awakening. Another one is tranquility. Again, important for concentration. We have to make the mind tranquil, calm. Another one is concentration itself, samadhi, which again is the way we describe the 8th part of the Eightfold Path, is sama samadhi, or right concentration. So concentration itself is one of these 7 factors of awakening. And the last of the 7 factors of awakening is upekkha, or equanimity. And equanimity is also the last of the 4 jhanas, the last of these 4 states of deep meditative absorption. So there's a large overlap between this part of the 4th foundation of mindfulness and our skill, ability, success in achieving concentration, and even perhaps jhana itself. So as I say, there's a very clear overlap here between mindfulness in the original texts, so it seems, and jhana, and the achievement of concentration. And this is one thing, perhaps the biggest thing, arguably, that may have been changed as our perception of and practice of this form of meditation went down the years, until nowadays, where jhana, and particularly in the 19th century, with the arising of people like Ledi Sayadaw, who I've discussed in a prior video, in Burma, de-emphasized jhana more specifically because I think he felt that in order to make meditation approachable by lay people, it had to be done in a way that was, shall we say, a little bit more compact, a little bit easier, that involved less time involved, because jhana, these deep states of absorption, require many, many hours of meditation over long periods of time for at least most of us to achieve. And so if we're going to say you have to achieve these things, it's going to be out of the purview of most lay people, including myself. I have a very, very limited experience with jhana, only the very lightest kinds. And so I think this is the way most people would come to it nowadays, and as a result it has been de-emphasized. But this de-emphasis, as we've argued, seems to have gone back many centuries and even millennia, perhaps until early after the time of the Buddha. So now what we've said is that the main text, these foundations of mindfulness, was originally much smaller. And again, if you look at Bhante Sujata's book, I'll have a link to it down below, in the show notes, you can see how his reconstruction goes. Nowadays, it's much larger. There is, I think, perhaps a tendency or a possibility among people, therefore, nowadays to say, oh, all of that additional information there is somehow fake, is somehow not something we should practice with, it's extraneous and unimportant. And I don't think any of that follows, because the extraneous material that was added to the Satipatthana Sutta is material that basically comes from elsewhere in the canon, elsewhere in the early canon, and that at least presumably was added to the Satipatthana Sutta by well-meaning monastics who felt that perhaps either consciously or unconsciously felt that a little bit of additional exposition was necessary in a particular place, and so brought material from elsewhere into the Satipatthana Sutta. I'm not aware of anything that's been added to the Satipatthana Sutta that comes from, that just comes from nowhere. I mean, for example, the addition of the Four Noble Truths and the five aggregates and the six sense bases to the fourth foundation, which is a big addition. All of that, yes, it's extraneous. It didn't seem to have been there originally, but it's perfectly fine material. It does come from elsewhere in the canon. It doesn't come from later schools of Buddhism or anything like that. It comes from the earliest texts, the earliest strain of Buddhism, at least as far as we know. So I think that's generally the case. We don't have to be quite so, perhaps quite so stringent as to say that all of this stuff is not worth practicing. Now, so that's a little discussion of mindfulness. There have been developments in other forms of meditation as well. I'll simply mention one of them, which is the Brahma viharas, or the meditative practice around loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, as we've already mentioned. This practice of the Brahma viharas has indeed also changed quite a bit from its earliest incarnation. And here I'll link up a playlist that I have of the Brahma viharas where I discuss some of this in a very small nutshell. In the earliest texts, the Brahma vihara meditations were much simpler. They simply involved basically radiating out, basically trying to engender or cause to arise the feelings of each of these in succession, let's say loving kindness, engender it in yourself and broadcast it out like a horn blower would blow a horn in a particular direction. And then you're supposed to do that in all six directions. So the four here, up above and down below. And that was how it was generally practiced in the early texts. Now, later on, in particular in the Visuddhimagga, which is a 5th century of the Common Era text, by a great Buddhist scholar and a commentator on the texts, Buddhaghosa, he quite seriously complicated the process or the practice of doing Brahma-vihara meditation. And it's his complications that we generally see nowadays, of picking out particular people, a particular succession of people who are closer to you and less close to you, and so on. I discuss all this in the video, but the point is that things have become more complicated because Buddhaghosa, or at least commentators before him that he relied upon, thought that these complications might be helpful. And indeed, I think they are for many of us, so there's nothing wrong with that. Also, it seems in a recent paper by Bhante Anālayo, Bhikkhu Anālayo, that the practice of compassion meditation has changed, in that originally compassion meditation practices were quite joyful, and that over the years and centuries after the Buddha's death, they seem to have become more empathetic. In other words, more interested in feeling the pain of the other rather than simply a joy about the possibility of the other person getting better. And I also did a video about that, which I will try to link here above. Another way that meditation seems to have changed, meditative practices seem to have changed. Now, Photistics also asks in this question about problematic states that arise in deep states of meditation. So basically what he's saying is that when we hear about such things as the hindrances, these are problematic states that arise for all of us, even for beginners. In fact, a lot for beginners. But what he wants to know is, are there problematic states that arise as you go farther along the path, which are quite different from those that beginners might have, and how do we deal with those? And there's a number of things to say here. What I would say is that in general in the early texts you don't find a discussion about different sorts of, let's say, hindrances that arise for very serious meditators. You just don't find, I don't believe that in general. What you do find are things that, like restlessness, for example, doesn't finally decay, doesn't finally go away until we reach awakening, until we become arahants. So there is some residue of restlessness that persists even for extremely advanced meditators. So we know these things don't go away. Also, we find in texts like the Brahmajala Sutta, which is the first text in the Digha Nikaya, where the Buddha talks about a number of wrong views, false beliefs. And many of these false beliefs, the Buddha says, arise out of mistaking meditation. That is, getting into meditative states and thinking that they are revelatory of the way the world is. So for example, getting into a state of deep jhanic meditation and thinking as a result that all of reality is joy, or all of reality is piti, is rapturous. That would be a mistake, because all of these meditative states are conditioned. They're productive. They come and they go. They're not permanent. And indeed, when the Buddha was starting out with his first two meditation teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, he was taught in that way. He was taught very deep states of formless meditations, and he was taught that these things were revelatory of reality. That is, when you got into the state of nothingness, or the state of neither perception nor non-perception, that was sort of revelatory of the way the world was. And the Buddha rejected those. And he rejected those basically for the same reason he rejects a lot of these, that these are conditioned states, they come and go. Once you've gotten to them and come back to your ordinary state of mind, you really aren't that significantly changed. So that is one, I would say, perhaps a hindrance that comes from deep states of meditation, is that we may take them too seriously. We may get attached to them and think that they reveal something amazing and true about reality, when all that they do is reveal something passing about a meditative state. That said, there was one famous example where the Buddha taught a number of monks a meditation on the foulness of the body. Now, this is one of the parts of meditation or mindfulness of the body. That is one of the parts of the first foundation of mindfulness, is to become aware of your internal organs and internal processes, and to focus on, in particular, the foulness of these processes. These processes are not beautiful. When you look at them, they're not beautiful. And the point of this was to release our attachment to the body, that we should do this in order to stop seeing the body as beautiful and worthy of attachment, either in ourselves and the people of others. Again, remember that he was teaching monastics here, so people are supposed to remain celibate, so that's part of it as well. But that was the practice. It was a practice of learning about the foulness of the body, not in order to think of the body as literally foul, because it's not, but in order to release our tendency to think of the body as beautiful and desirable. And it's said that after teaching this, the Buddha went on a long retreat, like a month-long retreat, and when he came back, he'd found that many of these monks who had done this practice had become so despondent about this, about the foulness of their bodies, that they had committed suicide. And this was obviously a horrible thing to happen, and what the Buddha told the remaining people there was that they should then change their meditation and focus on meditation of breathing, that is mindfulness of breathing, which is the basic practice of mindfulness in all of Buddhism, and really to us today. Because with the mindfulness of breathing, that's a much happier kind of mindfulness state, and I think he felt be more positive for them. And so this is one way, a particularly horrible and pernicious way, that meditation can go wrong, even for serious meditators. And this is one reason why I think any of you who are intending to do deep meditation, that is to say, meditation for long periods of time, a retreat type meditation where you're meditating many hours a day, perhaps over many days in succession, over many weeks perhaps, that you should do it with a qualified and experienced meditation teacher, and hopefully one who has some background in psychology. I believe that in most of the most prominent places that you can do meditation retreats, that the people there have been trained psychologically to deal with some of the potential problems that can arise when we go on long retreats. Now, this is not something that I have experience with myself in any real capacity. I've done very short retreat once and shorter retreats many times, but nothing particularly long. And I mean, I consider myself a scholar, not a meditation teacher for this very reason. And also, meditation in this way is not something you can really teach somebody, I think, when it comes to the deep, deep stuff over the internet. It has to be done in person, it has to be done face to face, so that you can see somebody in their eyes and see what they're going through, and it's got to be something that you've gone through yourself and can help them out of. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Now, if you find these kinds of talks of mine helpful in the scholarship and whatever else I can provide to you, consider checking out my Patreon page, which is linked down below. As I say, check out this new course I have on the Buddha's teaching to lay people. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, subscribe, and I hope we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.